That's a beautiful example and a question, Dave. Like, really beautiful. If your healing process hasn't happened effectively, if the acceptance is not completely total, then when you get triggered, then you do go back all the way, back again and bounce between all the stages. What I found with my ability to practice radical acceptance, it's a task I put on myself. So I make sure that I really work through the layers. I wring it out, and I'm constantly monitoring myself. Today, when I see memories of my father or my mother or my grandparents, they are exactly that. They're memories. Sometimes I smile, sometimes I cry, and that's okay. To cry is fine. To be nostalgic about that memory is absolutely fine. To wish that they were here today to create new memories is also okay. But to be overwhelmed by regrets and if-onlys, that's where there's a problem. That is what is so important about my mission. I want everyone to live their lives so that they have no regrets. I want them to live their relationships with their loved ones so that if they lose them tomorrow, they will have no regrets. One of the most common things I come across is people who say that I wish I would have spent more time with them. My thing is, if you can project yourself into the future and imagine losing this person, XYZ person, and if your regret on that day is going to be that you haven't spent enough time with them, then do it now. Spend time with them. It's so simple. Create the memories so that when that time comes, you have a chock full of memories to look back on. The only thing you will not have is the opportunity to create new ones. And that's it. It's not a big deal. It's actually really beautiful.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. This is Living the Next Chapter, and I have a very kind and generous author, guest, and new friend here on the podcast. And we are having to have a great conversation today. Multiple books written, more coming from our guest today. And I'm so happy to have Natasha here on the podcast. Natasha, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you here. Greetings.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me. I'm great this morning. How are you?
I am good as well. And just for those that are listening, where are you joining me today from?
Bombay in India.
Wow. I chatted with someone this morning earlier, and I spoke to somebody in Scotland, and now I am in India. So this is amazing how you can talk to people around the world and meet great people. Thank you for making time for us today on the podcast. It's great to have you here.
And it's great to be here.
Great. So tell me a little bit about your author story. Let's go back to the early days before you were an author. And what was the starting point for you to say, I want to take my thoughts and my expertise and my learnings and share it with the world through writing? Can you kind of take us back to what that was like for you to decide to become an author? Is that how that happened for you?
It's interesting that you ask it like this. I like it a lot. So first and foremost, I'll share with everyone who's listening that, like everybody else, I have a story that's long and complex. I have had a lot of traumas, some big, some small things that I've just not been able to let go, that have shaped me to who I am today. Now, as far as my writing journey is concerned, it will be incomplete without me actually talking about my healing journey, my journey of self-awareness. So which is why I included that piece. So by profession, I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. I am now a published author, a speaker, and a mentor. I work with money and manifestation, and my mission is to talk about death openly and often until it becomes a dinner table conversation. So having said all of this, if I take that bit in your question about my writer's journey. So when I was really young, before I used to, apparently my grandmother says I used to write plays And I used to put on performances in front of my grandparents and my parents. And I wrote a poem once about a tree that my paternal grandmother had published in a magazine. And she was a writer. She also was a very independent and a very high-spirited woman. She was very politically active. She was a professor. And my grandfather was a typical chauvinist man. So as a result, my father became so, and my father was also a narcissist. And so if you take all of these factors into the mix, my grandmother didn't really have a very good rep in the family. And often people would say, if they wanted to put me down, that I was a lot like her. And it's only with age and experience did I understand that the very things that made her special were the very things that the men, quote unquote, were basically using to vilify her. And so, I mean, she's been gone now, probably 20 years now. But I finally sort of like embraced the fact that I got the talent from her. So that's one part. The other part is my maternal grandmother, who died in April. It'll be 5 years. A week before she died, we were having a conversation, and I was saying something about my life experience, and she was just like, do you realize how fascinating your life has been? Just the way that you've taken your challenges and molded them. It's so interesting. And she said, you should write. And I'm like, me write? Like, who'd be interested in my story? And she's like, you'd be really surprised. She said, I recently read a book about this normal woman in a tiny village in India, and the book wasn't about anything except her everyday life. And I found it fascinating. So she said, if you share your words out there, you don't know who will connect with you, who'll be interested. So just write. And then a week later, she died. So obviously, Dave, that was like a huge catalyst for me. And I realized that I do have a very interesting journey, lots of different facets. And of course, when I studied clinical hypnotherapy, I did a lot of self-healing. I'm well on my way on my self-awareness journey. And so I thought, perhaps if I do share those stories with the world, it'll resonate with someone somewhere. And, I don't know where it's going to go. So then I decided I was going to honor both my grandmothers and write a book. However, I knew very little about the publishing world. I didn't know how to go about it. I am originally from the UK. I am an expat in India. I'm now married here, and therefore I'm living here and not in the UK. So I was very clear that I couldn't publish in India because I'm not an Indian writer. I don't think like Indians. I basically don't think like the majority of people here. My thoughts are international. My experiences are international. So I needed to be represented in the UK and in the US. And so I really had no clue. And I figured that a good starting point was to have an agent. And so I did a bit of research. I found some people, and I was about to set up meetings when I was going to go back to the UK for Christmas. And then lockdown happened. And so everything just went on the back burner. But everything happens for a reason. And when you look back, you can actually see the plan that universe or God or spirit, let's say God's plan for argument's sake. And when I look back, it couldn't have happened better for me because I discovered Clubhouse, which you and I are connected on as well. And that became my window to the entire world. Then one thing led to another. I met another person and another person, and I was invited to write a chapter in a book collaboration published in the US. So I was like, okay, this is perfect. Rather than having this whole entire book on my head when I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm sure a lot of viewers here, listeners here who are probably thinking about writing a book, this will be of relevance. That I thought if I do a chapter first, then it'll be like dipping my toe into this new world and figuring things out. also being part of a collaboration is great because you can express yourself at the same time. The whole thing's not riding on you. Like the reader doesn't have to connect only with you. If they don't, there's 24 other stories, 24 other voices, 24 other authors that they can pick and choose and resonate with what works for whom. And so then I signed up for that. That was released in August of last year, which made me a published author. It's called Wealth Codes, Sacred Strategies for Abundance. And so that's when my mission of talking about death started. And I used that chapter to talk about finding abundance through accepting death. Then I became a speaker on death, speaking on several different podcasts. And then I had a huge transformation, a huge epic transformation, which I then wrote about in Mindset Mastery, which just got released on the 22nd of January. That's also a collaboration. And, and so and that is how it's all like worked out. And now I've just signed up for a children's book collaboration that's coming out in May. And so my author's journey is well on its way. And so now I think I am in a good position to now start writing my whole book.
Wow, like that's a great overview. And what I love about that is that it helps to set the stage for our conversation today. Now that you've taken us through the journey to get to today. Now we can kind of unpack a little bit about the message that you're sharing. Because when we spoke in our pre-interview chat earlier, you shared a little bit about your story as a child and your interaction with sickness and with death and that whole side that most children wouldn't see or experience, and how that kind of shaped your journey as an adult and how you can help people. The one thing I would love to kind of get into in a moment is talking about maybe the differences around death from a cultural perspective, maybe the US versus India. There's different ways that people deal with the topic of death. And what I get from your teachings and what we've talked about is you really want to help people make this to be a conversation that's not taboo or something that is people are afraid to talk about. You want to take that away so that we can have a clear conversation about. So can you take us back to your childhood and some of your early recollections of dealing with death and seeing that as a child and how that shaped your journey today?
Absolutely. So before I get into the journey, I just want to say that, yes, there's a cultural difference between how people handle the rituals of death. But by and large, my experience in the last year, as I've been talking and interacting with all these different people, is that the taboo, the reluctance, the fear around facing the thought of one's death or thinking about losing one's loved ones is universal. There are some people who are self-aware enough and have done some processing, but by and large, it's a subject that's not discussed at all. Even if you were to Google how many books are available on the subject, you will actually be fascinated to see how few books there are. Like on a subject that's real, like we're all going to die, whether we like it or not, think about it or not, it's going to happen. We just don't know when and we don't know how. And that's where the mystery comes. And then people prefer not to get into solving the mystery or figuring it out for themselves. And so that's where the whole thing becomes taboo and in shadow and stuff. So that being said, my personal experience, my first face-to-face encounter with death was that of my grandfather, my paternal grandfather. And I loved him the most in the entire world, more than my own parents. He doted on me. I loved him. And he died when I was 14. And couple of months after my grandfather died, my mother fell seriously sick. And I write about that in Wealth Codes, which is, I'll give my chapter to the listeners of the podcast. And then if they like it, they can buy the whole book. So I write about this in detail over there, but my mother fell very sick and within 2 years, she was dead. So by 16, I had lost two of the major players in my life. Today, when I look back, it seemed like a really big deal because I didn't compute that my mother was only 43 and my father was only 45. Like, to me, they were like these old people and, these elderly people. Today, when I'm knocking on 50, I look back and I just have a completely different perspective on, why my father was unable to handle things. I mean, he was only 45. His wife had died and he had 3 young children, and I was a teenager, 16. Oh my goodness. I think about the puberty and the hormones and, it gives a different perspective to the whole thing. But obviously, I didn't process my mother's death and loss very well. I spent most of my adult life in denial and in anger. And it's only after I studied clinical hypnotherapy, which is basically only 10 years ago. It's my second career. And it's only when I started studying healing in depth, and then I started healing myself before I started healing anyone else, that these huge shifts and transformations have taken place. And of course, it's a journey, like I said, and it's going to continue till the day we die. And the pandemic was actually what became my catalyst to talk about death. Of course, losing my grandmother, like I said, that was big. That was pre-pandemic. And I'm really glad that she wasn't alive to see the pandemic. It was very devastating for a lot of old people to have no contact with their families anymore. Anyway, so in the pandemic, to realize that people of all stages and ages of life, regardless of like health or age, were just dropping dead left, right, and center. And people who were like successful business people, financial whizzes, just leaving their affairs completely awry. And when you don't take responsibility for your own life, when you don't consider your own death, when you don't leave things in order, your will, your last wishes, your loved ones have to deal with the shock and the grief. But then now they also have to clear up this mess. And again, this is universal, Dave, because yes, some countries have more bureaucracy than others. Like in India, it's way more complicated than, let's say, in the West, wherever in the West. But still, if the person dies without an official next of kin, without anything in order, including small things like what do you want done with the ashes? Does the person want to be buried or cremated? It's stuff like that then the family has to sit down and discuss. And then you have all these people who suddenly have a different point of view because everyone's assuming what that person would have wanted basis some vague conversations or your perception of what that person was like. So it's just very unnecessary. It creates a lot of tension within people, and it has a lot of charge that leads to a lot of family drama and unnecessary dynamics. So, I think by and large, as I've been discussing it more and more, I think the minute that a person starts working, they become responsible for leaving their affairs in order. You have an income, you need to decide who your nominee is, you need to decide what happens to your money. And then, obviously as you grow older and it's more complex, you have like assets and you have other things, then that obviously becomes even more important. But anybody of any age can do the responsible thing in today's digital age and have a locked document or a notepad which one person knows about that has all the passwords in it. Something simple like that. Make sure you have a nominee on your bank account. Small things like this, which don't happen, Dave, unless death is a normal day-to-day dinner table conversation. And honestly, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. Anything can happen to anybody at any time. And that's a fact.
Why do you think having a conversation is so hard to do? Is there fear? Is there a sense of coming to terms with the fact that we won't live forever? I'm 20 and I'm 43-year-olds are old people and I'm 20 and life is great and I'll never die. Like, why is it so hard to sit down and have this conversation in the beginning?
I think by and large, it's like I said, it's not knowing when and it's not knowing how. And so therefore we don't want to think about it, because even if we think about it, we don't have those answers. We don't have the answers to those two questions. Plus, it's the human hubris. Humans from the beginning of time have sought immortality, from, the Egyptians and the pharaohs and the mummies, and taking their wealth with them and whatever. It's just human beings don't like to think that their story is over. They always think there should be a legacy. That legacy is something that they are building, and then they may or may not be leaving it to children. What happens to somebody who's built a legacy but doesn't have children to leave it to? What happens? So many people don't even bother to think about that, of creating a trust, to let your legacy go on, to build a charity, I don't know, there's so many things that a person can do if they sit and consider it. But by and large, it's a difficult conversation, and it's difficult because we don't talk about it, which is why it's my mission. The more you talk about it, the easier it becomes. And we should start really young. So I mentioned my children's story. My first idea to write the children's story was I wanted to write about sibling rivalry. That led me to think about change. Now, the interesting thing about the grieving process, the 7 stages of grief, is that it is the same for whatever major change you might be going through. It can be a divorce. It can just be a breakup with a girlfriend. It can be getting fired from a job. You still go through those 7 stages of, it should be called change and not grief. But yes, when some major, from little to big, it's all the same. And death is part of that. So actually, children should be taught, because what's the right age? So I was 16, like I said, when my mother died, but I was 14 when she fell sick. So she was no longer accessible to us from when I was 14, right? So I was 16, my brother was 13, my sister was 10, which means when my mother fell sick, my sister was only 8. So nobody sat and explained to her what illness meant. Nobody explained to her where her mother had gone when she was in hospital. Nobody explained to her that mommy's dead and what that means. There was no conversations, right? Does that mean she didn't have to handle it? Of course she had to. So not talking about it didn't really help things, right? And so in my children's story, even though I'm writing about sibling rivalry, I put it in the basket of writing about change. And there I brought in death in a normal kind of a way. I was talking about that in nature, everything dies, and plants and trees. But still, I brought in that concept, and I wrote the word death several times in the chapter. Now, that gives a conversation starting point to the parent who's reading the story to the child. It gives the child the opportunity to ask a question, what's death? And it starts this conversation. And, I don't think it's too early for any parent to tell their child that, I don't know what might happen. One day, mommy might not be here. Because honestly, Dave, whether that child loses their mother at 8 or 10 or 16 or 60, it's going to be sad at any day. But the child will always, the person, even the 60-year-old, will remember mommy telling them that when they were 6. And it will give them solace.
How would you navigate this question when we are talking about death with children, when we are talking about death in a more open conversation that you're leading us to, that we should have this kind of communication? Should we use real definable terms when we're talking, or is it okay to use maybe words that seem to lessen the impact of death? So, for example, instead of saying died, we say passed away, because that feels a little bit less final, or less, I guess, less real, right? They've passed away. They're sleeping. They're in a better place. Or should we be focused on the actual word of death, dying, and the finality of that in our conversation? What do you think?
See, personally, when you're asking the question like this, then the words you're talking about really go to explain to somebody when the death has already happened. So, like, let's say somebody's grandfather has passed away, so then you want to say that, okay, he's passed on, he's in a better place, and all of those things. But it's also important to use the real word because of the impact. And in that situation, if there's been a loss right now and we're having the conversation right then what you're saying is absolutely correct. And that depends on the situation, depends on the person, depends on the family circumstances, depends on the age of everybody involved. So there are lots of variables. My mission is to talk about death way before it actually happens, so that people are prepared. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel sad. It doesn't mean that you are not going to go through the 7 stages of grief. Of course it does. Of course you will, I mean. But by having the conversations, a lot of the extra complications can be taken care of in advance. Now, I'll give you 2 examples of what's happened to me recently. The more I talk about it, the more clear I am. I'm very matter of fact on how I talk about it. I don't extra charge the word death, and I don't plaster over it either. I just talk about it as a matter of fact, and then that sets the tone for the conversation. So the person in front of me also has to match me, or I give up, because I don't need to force my point of view on anybody. I'm just encouraging a conversation. I'm encouraging self-responsibility. And, if you're self-responsible for your affairs, then you're also being responsible for your loved ones. So recently I was talking to this aunt, one of my mother's best friends, who now obviously is in her late 70s. And she's like, what are you doing now, Natasha? And I'm like, I write. She's, oh, okay, that's nice. I said, yeah, I write about death. And she looks at me and she goes, what? What do you mean you write about death? So I said, well, I think more people should talk about death. So she goes, no, it's so scary. I haven't even written my will yet. Why would you talk about death? So I said, well, this is exactly why I'm talking about it. What do you mean you don't have your will? So she's like, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to do. So I said, but this is exactly why you need to talk to your children and fix it. And Dave, this is how it started. But the conversation went on for an hour and it was lively. It was funny. She started talking about all the incidences in her life where death happened unexpectedly to friends, to family members, and how bad things were left. And I believe that conversation, if that leads her to actually pull up her socks and write her will, then, I've achieved something great.
Exactly. Now, so when we bought our first home as a family, our children were small, and part of purchasing our home was our lawyer requested a will as part of the process. So we had to sit down as a family and write out our will, which also at that time, because our children were young, we had to come up with, well, worst case scenario, and if my wife and I passed away or died, what would happen with our children? They were all under the age of 7 at the time. So we had 3 children. So we had to come up with that and had to have a conversation with a relative about what would happen and all of that. And I remember looking at my oldest child at the time and the look of horror and fear in his eyes as he asked the question, what's going on? Like, are you guys sick? Like, why are we talking about this? Why are we making a will? What's happening? What is going on? And you could see fear in his eyes because this was a new topic. And I think, to be quite honest, as a parent, we didn't prepare them well for the conversation because it was a task on a to-do list to purchase a house, to create the will. So we were just going through the actions without thinking about the impact on our children of having the conversation. And I think we probably could have done a better job, to be quite honest, at that moment of how we presented the topic in a healthy way with them. And we've worked through this. And my children are all now empty nesters and everybody's good. But at that moment in time, we could probably had used your expertise and your assistance to do it well, to have that conversation well with small children in our family and within our home. Do you have some advice for someone listening today that's maybe in that stage of life and making a will out? How can we communicate with our family, especially young children, within our own home around the topic of death?
So it's very interesting what you said, what you went through, and I could actually feel myself there with your son. So the point is that, even if they're grown up and you're empty nesters now, that thing that happened to him in that moment of time is still inside him. And when you do eventually pass on, I prefer saying pass on than pass away. So when you do eventually pass on, he's going to go right back to that moment. So my advice would be to, just talk to him even today. Just as far as children are concerned, there are just two rules. Children want to feel safe and they want to know that they are loved. And that's it. So, of course, I'm sure you must have said to them at that time that don't worry, nothing's wrong with us and, stuff like that. But it's a good window to start the conversation and there, if you could go back. But basically for those who are in the situation today where they have young children today and they might have to, and they're listening to this, then it's a good opportunity to then talk about what death means and to say nothing is wrong with us right now and we have to prepare this in case something happens. But to maintain that balance, to the child is afraid because their safety is you, their security is you, the thought of you not being there for any reason, and that includes divorce as well, right? So divorce is a death that we don't consider. So it's the conversations we tell our children when there's a divorce, right? That mommy and daddy both love you. We're both still here for you. Your life's not good. Whatever you say to them during divorce, you can say to them about death. It's the same thing. We don't just look at it in the same way. If it's a death of their reality, if it's the death of their love and their safety being threatened, then they need to be assured that it's not being threatened. And the parents have to ensure that it's not. Because that's really all children want. Yes, the Xboxes and the iPads are great, but what they really need is to feel safe, that they can come home, they can talk to you about anything, that you'll always be there for them.
I love it. And one thing I'd love to jump back to, too, you mentioned about the 7 stages of grief, really should be renamed the 7 stages of change. And I wrote it down as you said it. I think that's a key point because you're right. It's not just, those 7 stages aren't just focused on the grief process. It can be divorce. It could be any kind of change. And you said job loss, any of that. Do you think in the 7 stages of grief change that those stages have to happen in the order that they are listed? Or do you think they can bounce around and change depending on the situation?
So that's exactly what the process is. The process is defined as such that it's not a linear chronological process. You do jump in between stages back and forth several times. It depends on the person's ability to successfully navigate the process. And you just know that you're complete is when you reach acceptance. Except for that, you can use the stages of change or the process to basically monitor where you're at. So say, for example, you've had a major change in your life. Let's say you quit your job or you were fired, and then you find yourself very irritable. You find yourself snapping at people. That's the anger stage. And when you can name it, then there's a reason why you're feeling irritable. And when, things get complicated when people around you are like, why are you behaving like this? And how can I explain to you? I just lost my job. Give me a break, right? So that's the thing, right? So depression or sadness, grief, that's only one stage, which is why the stages of grief is misrepresentative, right? The other stages are like shock and denial and bargaining. Just the sadness, crying is the depression stage, the grief stage. Right? Then there's testing, then there's finally acceptance. And anger is a huge stage because anger has all the shades, like I said, from irritation all the way to full-blown outbursts.
Yeah. I can see it. Like, you can see it in so many spots in your life. And even though you think it might be done, something could come back and trigger a memory. It could be anything from a song, a place, a smell, of food, of a social event, just a location. For us, if we have Facebook, you'll have Facebook memories pop up. And it's like, oh, 8 years ago, you were here. And you're like, there's the person. They're no longer with me. And, and I thought I was done with this. I thought I've worked through all of this. Natasha, I've done the stages, but then Facebook feeds me this. And now I'm looking into the face of somebody that I miss. And I find myself slide back again and start getting angry and start the process all over again. So in your opinion, do you think that when you reach the acceptance stage, you are truly acceptant of what's happened? Or do you think that your acceptance is limited to that moment? How do you feel about that?
That's a beautiful example and a question, Dave, like really beautiful. So if your healing process hasn't happened effectively, if the acceptance is not completely total, then when you get triggered, then you do go back all the way back again and bounce between all the stages. What I found with my ability to practice radical acceptance, it's a task I put on myself. So I make sure that I really work through the layers. I wring it out, and I'm constantly monitoring myself. Today, when I see memories of my father, my mother, or my grandparents, they are exactly that. They're memories. Sometimes I smile, sometimes I cry, and that's okay. To cry is fine. To be nostalgic about that memory is absolutely fine. To wish that they were here today to create new memories is also okay. But to be overwhelmed by regrets and if onlys, that's where there's a problem. That is what is so important about my mission. I want everyone to live their lives so that they have no regrets. I want them to live their relationships with their loved ones so that if they lose them tomorrow, they will have no regrets. One of the most common things I come across is people who say that I wish I would have spent more time with them. My thing is, if you can project yourself into the future and imagine losing this person, XYZ person, and if your regret on that day is going to be that you haven't spent enough time with them, then do it now. Spend time with them. It's so simple. Create the memories so that when that time comes, you have a chock full of memories to look back on. The only thing you will not have is the opportunity to create new ones. And that's it. It's not a big deal. It's actually really beautiful.
Yeah. I love that frame of thinking of just if that's your regret in the future, then make it your reality today and spend time with that person. That is so simple, right? When you think about it, it's like, well, that makes sense. Yeah. Before we go, because you've been so gracious with your time, I have a question that I would love to kind of get your thoughts on. When you have, for your mother through her illness and then her eventual death, you had a period of time to kind of work through a little bit of grieving while she was here with us still. So it kind of, in a sense, gave you a little bit of a runway, a little bit of a path that you could walk in advance of her eventually passing away. But what about that situation with a long-term illness for the family and how they grieve compared to something sudden or accidental or immediate that it just comes from nowhere and there's no preparation time for the family? Is there a difference in how we deal with grief for a sudden death compared to a death that takes a period of time?
So, as far as my mother's example is concerned, the family wasn't prepared. My mother had leukemia, and it was, a long-term illness. It took her 2 years to die. It should have taken her, let's say, 10. But anyway, it's a different subject. But I was 14, and from 14 to 16, there was no preparation of the death because nobody had told her she was going to die. In fact, I remember, this is the thing, people think that children, okay, let's put it this way. People don't understand how much children actually understand. They pick up on your nonverbal cues. They hear and see everything. Adults think that unless they don't sit down with the child and talk about it, that the child doesn't know. Now, that is like the biggest misconception, because when I saw, so my parents and my grandparents, they were all whispering about my mother's illness. Nobody talked to us about it. I remember clearly climbing onto my father's lap one day and asking him, does mommy have leukemia? Now, I didn't even know what leukemia meant. I just knew that they were whispering. I knew this word was long and scary, and they didn't want us to hear this word. Does that mean that I didn't know? No, I knew. They didn't discuss her illness. They didn't discuss that she might die. And then when she died, there was basically no processing. But that's just my experience. And the thing is, Dave, that different people will experience death in different ways, like you said. Sudden death, I mean, suicide is a sudden death. You don't know that your loved one's going to kill themselves tonight. Suicide is a big one. Cardiac arrests, which have like gone on the rise suddenly after pandemic. So, drastically, people can just leave you like this without you even, being prepared. So the only difference I would say is the shock, the first stage of grief, which is shock, that when a sudden illness happens or a sudden death happens for whatever reason, then the shock is more severe. But the rest of the 6 stages can occur as per the individual unique relationship and circumstance. And a long-term illness doesn't necessarily prepare the caregivers. The only person it actually might prepare is the person who's dying. They will reach acceptance of the fact that their time is up. And that's a very valid point that you brought that up, because another thing that I have seen is if that person hasn't prepared their will, like today, like you and I who are young and healthy today, we need to prepare it today. Because if we get a long-term illness, we go towards acceptance of the end of life. Material things no longer matter to us. So we don't even care what happens. But that's the problem. We need to care because we're leaving the mess behind, like I said before. So, whether it's sudden death, whether it's a long-term illness, I think it depends on the person, on how they're going to accept what's happening. Because I have seen families put their loved ones on life support, keep on calling the doctors, keep on extending the person's life. They want to do everything possible to keep the person alive. And I don't think they're ever prepared to really say goodbye.
Yeah.
So that's why discussions like this are very important for both the situations. So I'm going to be writing my whole book on grief now that I've submitted all my chapters. My task for this year is to write a book on grief. And you spoke about all these different types of death. I have actually experienced front row, personal, first-hand experiences of all the different kinds of death that you can imagine. And so I will come back here and discuss it with you once I've written that.
Are you promising to come back? Is that what I'm getting? A promise?
If you invite me, of course, I'll come back as many times as your listeners need help and inspiration. I'm happy to be here.
Of course I'm going to have you back. Of course. That's a given. That's amazing.
Thank
you. Natasha, you have been such a great conversation today to have with you. I'm so happy that you had time to do this. I want to honor your time. Can you let people know, Natasha, I would love for you to speak directly to our audience and just encourage them to have the conversation, to use your resources, your books as a starting point to help you plan out this conversation. But can you just speak to our audience? Just again, let's just solidify for anyone listening how important it is to have a conversation, to have a plan, and to make the conversation around death to be more acceptable in our society, in our homes, with our spouse, our partners, our children. Can you just kind of speak to our listeners and just kind of come back to that topic and help us close off today with your thoughts?
Absolutely. So the first thing I'd like to tell you all out there is that if you look at death as a gateway to abundance, to freedom, that once you accept that life is finite, then you can consider your life in a different light. You're able to reprioritize your time and your resources. And ironically, you can actually learn to live every day to the fullest. It's not irresponsible like a carpe diem, or let's go out and just have fun because we don't know if there's going to be a tomorrow. It's actually about having a lot of self-responsibility and just joy and gratitude for what is. I hope that helps. Thank you very much.
That's awesome, Natasha. That's great. And how do we connect with you, Natasha? If we have a question for you, we have a comment for you, we want to thank you for being on the podcast. How do we reach out and get in touch with you?
So the best way really is Instagram, because I've got so many things evolving and playing out that's the one platform that I always update. So my Instagram handle is at the rate of BodySpeak.in. So, if we'll put those in the show notes for you, there's Instagram. And then for your copy of my chapter from Wealth Codes, you just have to email me at Natasha at mind-bodyspeak.com and put Dave WC chapter 11, and I'll be happy to send that chapter to you guys. Those are the best ways. And you can send me any questions on email and DM me on Instagram as well.
And you will have the chance to speak to a genuine, amazing author, person, great person. I'm so pleased that you have time, Natasha, to spend with us. You bring light into the room. There you go. How's that? Does that sound good?
I love it. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much.
It's great. Thank you for being part of the podcast. And as you promised to come back. I'm going to hold you to that and continue our conversation because you brought so much value today, and I really do appreciate you. So thank you for being part of Living the Next Chapter. Thank you for being part of Living the Next Chapter. Hey, we're having such a great time talking to authors around the world. If you are an author and you would like to be on this very show, I would love to talk to you. livingthenextchapter.com, livingthenextchapter.com, livingthenextchapter.com is the best way to get in touch with us. There you'll find our social media and blah, 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 la-di-da, and such. You, author, soon-to-be author, new author, currently writing your book author, published author, we need you here. The seat's empty, microphone set up, we're waiting for you. livingthenextchapter.com. We would love to have you on the podcast. Yeah, I'm talking to you. Yeah, you should be here. See you at livingthenextchapter.com.
Mindshift Power Podcast, the podcast for teenagers and those who work with them. There's a huge problem in America today. There's a very large disconnect between teenagers and the adults who work with them. I'm looking to bridge that gap with real, raw, honest conversation, not held back by the chains of political correctness. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand. Want to understand teenagers today? Listen to this podcast. This podcast is for teens in the U.S. and Canada. To learn more, go to fatimabay.com/podcast or just look for Mindshift Power Podcast on any listening platform. I look forward to you being a faithful listener.